Welcome everyone to the WERA 103 presentation today. My name is Rob Mickelson and I'll be hosting the presentation today. This is a series of ongoing educational talks sponsored by a group called WERA 103, which is a Western United States group that is focused on improving nutrient management and water quality. Today we're pleased to have Dr. Jim Ippolito present the lecture. Briefly, Dr. Ippolito is a professor in the Department of Soil and Crop Science at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. Jim received his bachelor's degree from the University of Delaware before moving on to Colorado State University, where he received his master's and PhD degrees. Jim has worked in several different environments, including the USDA Agricultural Research Service, and now at the Colorado State University Soil and Crop Science Department. Jim has an active research and teaching program, and I think you'll enjoy this presentation today on the basics and environmental relevance of phosphorus. So with that, Jim, let me go ahead and give you the control panel, and we'll go ahead and start.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Thanks for inviting me to give today's webinar. It's my pleasure to talk about some of the basics and environmental relevance of phosphorus and the issues that we see across not only the nation, but the globe in terms of phosphorus and its role that it plays in both growing plants and environmental implications. And so what I'd like to do is start out with some basics and describe, hopefully in brief, soil phosphorus cycle, because this is the basis for growing plants as well as environmental issues. And if you have a better understanding of phosphorus and its cycling in soil systems, you might have a better understanding of how to offset environmental implications due to phosphorus or excessive phosphorus. So when we look at the phosphorus cycle, anytime you look at cycles or cycling in soils, and you see a lot of lines and arrows, that tells you that the cycle is relatively complex, and phosphorus is by no means any exception. And so I like this phosphorus cycle because it breaks down components into essentially three major areas. So for example, the orange areas are the ways or means by which phosphorus can be lost from systems, and we understand this relatively completely. We lose phosphorus from systems due to simple harvesting, from soils, obviously plant uptake, and from soils either leaching or runoff and erosion. The literature tells us that for most instances in most soil systems, leaching is relatively minor, although that's not always the case. And if you have questions about this, I'll show you my contact information at the end of this slide presentation, and you can talk to me further about that. By and large, we lose phosphorus via runoff and erosion from soil systems. Inputs to soils are mainly from mineral fertilizers, inorganic fertilizers, or organic fertilizers. Of course, plant residues contain phosphorus as well, and there's some minor components of phosphorus deposition via dust. Within the soil itself, there's essentially 5 pools. And we're going to talk about these pools a little more specifically on the next few slides, but in general, the pools are split up between inorganic phases and organic phases, roughly a 50-50% split. The pool that's in the center of this slide, the soluble phosphorus pool, is the pool by which plants draw phosphorus from for uptake and growth, etc. And to be honest with you, that pool is relatively small in soils, and you should be aware of the fact that phosphorus in these two forms that are shown here, H2PO4 and HPO4, the primary forms of orthophosphate that are taken up by plants, and both of those are known as orthophosphate in general. This soluble pool tends to have relatively low concentrations of phosphorus relative to the other pools. And what this tells you is that phosphorus does not like being by itself in soils. It loves being bound to organics or inorganic phases. And so let's describe those. And I want to start on the right-hand side with the green circles. And then I'll talk about some of the text on the screen. Let me ask you this, Rob. Can you see my arrow? Hopefully you can see my arrow. But phosphorus in soils that are unweathered, they start out as primary minerals. These are apatite type minerals. These are calcium phosphates. Over time, the soils that we typically work with in either the western or eastern United States do not contain primary minerals. They weather, they release soluble phosphorus to the pool in the center of the diagram. That form of phosphorus does not like sticking around, and typically secondary minerals or compounds precipitate out of solution. And these secondary minerals can be calcium phosphates, iron phosphates, manganese phosphates, aluminum phosphates. And these are typically dependent on pH. And so what happens, there's sort of a cascade where these primary minerals dissolve. They release soluble P to the soluble P pool. They reprecipitate as highly soluble mineral forms, and over time, those mineral forms follow sort of a cascade to less and less soluble mineral forms. And those less and less soluble mineral forms are dependent on the pH conditions of the soil. To give you a little more background, this is a relatively famous phosphorus mineral diagram that was developed actually here at Colorado State University by a world famous soil chemist named Willard Lindsay. These diagrams were actually developed in the 60s and 70s, and this one was published in one of his famous books, Soil Chemical Equilibrium, in 1979. And what this describes, and let me click the forward button here, this might make this diagram a little simpler for most folks. So on the x-axis is essentially soil pH from 3 to 9. On the y-axis is phosphorus availability in soils. And the greater the lines on this graph, the greater the available phosphorus present. And so, for example, if we were at a soil pH of, say, 7.5, and you added an inorganic phosphorus fertilizer, that line would not even be on this graph. It would be either at the 0 value on the y-axis or greater. We add phosphorus fertilizers because they're relatively soluble. They dissolve and readily release phosphorus. And over time, that phosphorus becomes less and less soluble, essentially following this cascade down on this graph. From the very top, this DCP line, which is dicalcium phosphate dibasic, it forms, it dissolves and reprecipitates as OCP or octocalcium phosphate, so forth and so on. And eventually, at high pH, in high pH systems, the phosphorus that is relatively insoluble are hydroxyapatites and fluorapatites. And the same thing holds true under acidic conditions. The phosphorus phases that are relatively insoluble that form over time are forms such as barysite or strengite. And these are aluminum phosphates or iron phosphates that are found in soils. And they're relatively insoluble. They can be both present in high quantities under acidic conditions, or under basic conditions, hydroxyapatite or fluorapatite can be present in high quantities, but they don't readily release phosphorus to the soil environment, and plants subsequently suffer. That's the reason why we add phosphorus fertilizers. So that's precipitation reactions. Other reactions that occur that pull phosphorus out of the soluble pool are adsorption reactions. And these are just as important as secondary reactions or secondary precipitation reactions. This is where soluble phosphorus in that center pool on the diagram forms reactions with surfaces of minerals that are present in the soil. Those could be aluminum or iron oxides, clays, or calcium carbonates. And these phases that are present in soil are typically in equilibrium with the soluble phosphorus pool, the pool in the center of the diagram in the bottom right-hand corner. And to give you an idea how this works, this is a general schematic for phosphate sorption onto an aluminum hydroxide or an aluminum oxide. And this is the general scheme that occurs. So we'll go from left to right. On the left-hand side, this is an aluminum hydroxide. It's a mineral. In the presence of H2PO4, which is orthophosphate, a reaction can occur where this orthophosphate kicks water, essentially, off of the mineral and forms a bridge. And if you look at the picture in the center, the phosphate is forming one bond with an aluminum ion. This form of phosphate we call labile. And the reason why we call this labile is because there's only one bond holding the phosphate molecule onto this aluminum hydroxide. And that makes it, for the removal of phosphate, relatively easy. If we follow the reaction to the right one more step, you can see that we remove another water molecule. And now phosphate's bound to aluminum using two bonds. This makes the bonding mechanism stronger of phosphate to aluminum, and we call this non-labile. These are forms of phosphorus that are really difficult to break off. It's hard to break these bonds and remove phosphate from the aluminum oxide or hydroxide. And I like to think of this as being a kid at a playground, and if you're going across monkey bars and you're holding onto the monkey bar with one hand, it's relatively easy to fall. But if you're holding on with two hands, you have a less likelihood of falling. Same thing happens with phosphate and adsorption. These processes actually occur on calcium carbonates as well as iron hydroxides or oxides in soils. You should know that every soil across the globe has the ability to absorb some phosphorus, and that's dependent on the clays that are present and the anion exchange capacity of clays, or the ability of clays to attract and hold negative charges. It also depends on the amount of iron and aluminum oxides or hydroxides that are present, as well as calcium carbonate present. So if we look at this phosphorus cycle down in the bottom right-hand corner, we've basically touched on the three green circles on the right-hand side. And what I like to do is just target briefly the green circle on the left-hand side, the organic phosphorus pool. And this is a pool that many of us tend to ignore in soils, but it's nonetheless really important because about 50% of the phosphorus that's present in soil is bound in an organic phase. And those organic phases come from animal manures, biosolids, plant residues, other organic materials that you may add back to the soil. And the typical forms of phosphorus that we find in this organic phase are phytic acids, phospholipids, and nucleic acids, all three of which contain phosphorus in some form or another. For example, phytic acid on the left-hand side of the screen has quite a bit of orthophosphate bound to this compound. Phospholipids, if you've heard this term before, phospho, obviously is telling you something, there's phosphorus present. In the blue circles, this contains phosphorus that can be broken down and released to the environment, and nucleic acids such as DNA and RNA also contain phosphorus. In all three instances, these materials contain phosphorus in forms that cannot be used by plants. And so via enzymatic activity or the release of enzymes from either plant roots or microorganisms, those enzymes attack the bonds that hold phosphate onto these organic phases, breaking those bonds and releasing phosphorus to the soluble pool that you see in the phosphorus cycle in the bottom right-hand corner. And to give you an idea of how this works, this is a general reaction for an enzyme called phosphatase. And this enzyme cleaves phosphate from organic functional groups represented by R on the left-hand side. And in the presence of water, which is really important, this phosphatase enzyme reacts to cleave phosphate from the functional group. It replaces that functional group with OH. So replacement of phosphate with OH, and hydrogen goes on to the phosphate molecule. And so this reaction it requires the enzyme, it requires water, and if you look at the reaction, it's splitting of water. We call this hydrolysis, and this is relatively common in a lot of enzymatic activities, especially related to phosphorus and release of phosphorus from organic phases. So that's all I want to say about the phosphorus cycle, and hopefully that gives you a more general idea of how phosphorus acts and interacts in systems. What I'd like to do next is focus on phosphorus and plant relationships, and this is, I think, really, really interesting. And so plants have evolved over eons and have created relationships with microorganisms in soils to help advance or help increase the availability of nutrients to the plant. And in terms of phosphorus, this relationship is really important. In most terrestrial plants, there's an association between the plants and a fungi called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. These are symbiotic associations between the roots of plants and the fungus. I mean, you can see the fungus in some of these pictures here. The left-hand picture and the center picture, these white strands or strings are the fungus. These are called hyphae. And they're also illustrated in these electron micrograph images in the bottom right-hand corner. And if you didn't know any better, you would say, well, this plant's infected, and that's not good. Well, you would be partially correct. The plant is infected, but it's a good association or a symbiotic association. And this is what happens. The association forms, the root or the plant provides food to the fungus, essentially by pumping down carbohydrates from leaves through the stalk to the roots. That's a carbon source or an energy source for the microorganisms. And that energy source helps the fungus explore more of the soil and increase nutrient, or in this case, phosphorus uptake. The really interesting thing about this is roots typically explore maybe between 1 to maybe up to 5% of soil volume. So roots don't really see a lot of the phosphorus that's present in the soil, especially available phosphorus. And the arbuscular mycorrhizae expands that volume that's explored by the roots to find more phosphorus and increase phosphorus availability to plants. And like I said, about 90 to 95% of the plants that are found on Earth have this association. However, I think if you're working in production agriculture, maybe you have or have not heard of this, but sugar beets are one of the crops that we grow globally that do not require the AM fungi for exploring the soil and increasing phosphorus availability to the plant. And in fact, there's a syndrome called corn following sugar beet syndrome, whereby if you didn't know any better, you would say that the plants on the right corn that have followed sugar beet in this set of plots on the left, they're obviously phosphorus deficient. Purpling of the colors, the lower leaves. And this is because sugar beets do not require the AM fungi. And so the fungi go dormant in between sugar beet and corn. Then you plant corn, which requires AM fungal associations. And before the AM fungi sort of wake up from the soil and start doing their job, sometimes corn looks phosphorus deficient. To be honest with you, in research that we've done in Idaho, we've noticed that by simply not applying phosphorus fertilizers to offset this deficiency and letting the corn grow out of it, yields ended up being equal to if we had applied phosphorus fertilizer. So I think it's important to note that you could be throwing away your money if you didn't know what you were looking at. This is sort of an important association here. Some other information about soil phosphorus and plant relationships. And I mentioned this in the phosphorus cycling diagram in the bottom left-hand corner, that plants take up phosphorus from the soluble phosphorus pool in the center of this diagram in that green circle. And the form of phosphorus that plants take up, there's two forms that are mainly taken up by plants. That's H2PO4 or HPO4. Those are both referred to as orthophosphate, but they're obviously different forms, and I'll tell you why in a minute. I think more importantly, I'd like to tell you that phosphorus, when it's taken up by plants, phosphorus arrives at the root via diffusion. And let me explain this hopefully relatively shortly. So there's 3 ways or 4 ways, I'll describe 3 ways by which nutrients are taken up by plants. And one of the ways is called mass flow, as shown in this bottom right-hand corner picture. And mass flow is simply the mass of water being moved to the root via translocation, and that water carrying nutrients with it, dissolved nutrients. And that's a great way for nutrients to be taken up by plants, but phosphorus doesn't follow this mass flow approach. Roots can also grow and intercept nutrients. That's called root interception. And that plays a very minor role in phosphorus uptake. By and large, diffusion dominates phosphorus uptake. And what do I mean by diffusion? Well, you have these primary or secondary minerals or phosphorus bound to the surface of iron oxides or hydroxides. And those minerals or those phosphorus molecules that are sorbed have to dissolve from those phases and go into solution in order for the plant to take that up. I can tell you that diffusion occurs over short distances, 1 to 2 centimeters within the soil. And so I think it's important to note that roots only explore maybe 1 to 5% of the soil volume, and thus they don't really see, in quotations, they don't really see phosphorus. And so the AM fungal association is very important for uptake of phosphorus. And let me get back to the point of H2PO4 and HPO4 and the term orthophosphates. And sometimes people have difficulty understanding what orthophosphates are, and I'm no exception. And so I've learned this over the years that orthophosphates is sort of a general term that we use to describe the forms of phosphorus that are taken up by plants. But if you were to look at orthophosphates, they encompass H3PO4, which is phosphoric acid, H2PO4, HPO4, and PO4. And you can see by the reactions on the left-hand side that these 4 forms actually change and they dissociate and release hydrogens. And what that tells you is that these forms that are present in soils are dependent on the amount of hydrogens that are actually present in the soil, which is directly related to pH. And so if we look at this diagram on the right-hand side, it shows you the 4 different forms of orthophosphate that may be present as a function of pH. And when we talk about soils, we're generally between these 2 vertical green bars in terms of soil pH. Somewhere between pH 5, 5.5, and maybe pH 9. And if you look at what that encompasses H2PO4 at the lower pH values and HPO4 at the higher pH values. And thus, when we talk about orthophosphate and plant uptake, we typically focus on H2PO4 and HPO4. That's just an FYI for everyone. In terms of the importance of phosphorus in plants, and actually you almost could relate everything on this slide to not only plants, but microorganisms, animals, humans, anything that's really living. Since we're talking about plants, the primary function of phosphorus in plants, in my eyes, is energy and energy transfer in the form of adenosine diphosphate and adenosine triphosphate. These are high energy containing compounds that allow me to talk to you today, for allowing plants to respire, photosynthesize, transport nutrients across membranes, and synthesize DNA, lipids, phospholipids. Anything in the plant that requires energy requires phosphorus. Phosphorus is also required for growth and development. It plays a role in plants and their susceptibility or ability to resist disease and cold. And it also plays a very important role in biological nitrogen fixation in legumes. And again, that's partially, if not greatly, involved with energy. If we look at plant response to phosphorus nutrition, so the application of phosphorus fertilizers, we've noted over decades that when we have positive phosphorus nutrition in soils, that increases plant and root growth, speed to maturity, and seed and fruit quality set. And this is a great example. I realize this is a very old picture, but it illustrates a really important point. And I show this in my class every year. This shows you sorghum with or without starter fertilizer and the degree to which the plants arrive at maturity. Simply by adding 12 pounds per acre to this system, we've seen increase in speed to maturity. I think it's really interesting to show you this too. So this is an orange study, obviously, and left-hand side shows you an orange with adequate phosphorus versus the right-hand side where the orange was grown under phosphorus deficient conditions. And if I were a consumer, I think I'd rather buy the orange on the left than the right. And so this gets me thinking when I find oranges on the right at my grocery store, it really makes me think about phosphorus deficiency almost every time I crack open an orange that looks like the one on the right. In terms of deficiency symptoms, if you were a producer and you noticed phosphorus deficiency symptoms, these are classic deficiency symptoms that almost hardly look like any other nutrient that affects plant growth. In terms of deficiencies, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, phosphorus is the only plant nutrient that causes purplish or reddening of leaves on older leaves. No other micronutrient or macronutrient does this. And what this tells you is because there's dark purpling on older leaves, and you see the deficiency on older leaves, this tells you that phosphorus is mobile in the plant. And what does that mean? That means that if the plant perceives a phosphorus deficiency, to overcome that, and it's not pulling phosphorus from the soil, to produce new leaves, it translocates phosphorus within the plant from older to newer leaves. And that's important because it helps you pinpoint phosphorus deficiencies to a greater degree of certainty than otherwise. And so here are some other examples. Here's phosphorus deficiency grown in wheat and phosphorus deficiency in daisy. And again, it's purplish color on older leaves, classic phosphorus deficiency. And so how do we overcome deficiencies? I think most of you on this webinar probably know that we use phosphorus fertilizers. Where do these phosphorus fertilizers come from? It's not magic. And in fact, we actually mine rock phosphate to generate phosphorus fertilizers. So here's a mine in southeastern Idaho that's mining for rock phosphate. And the form of phosphorus that they're mining is actually relatively insoluble. In fact, most of the Earth's phosphorus is found in forms that are relatively insoluble. So for example, this mine in southeastern Idaho, they're mining rock phosphate. It's calcium phosphate that's very insoluble. And so I drew a circle on this diagram that you saw earlier. And these phosphorus-containing minerals are hydroxyapatites or fluorapatites. They're very, very low in terms of solubility. And I can tell you for a fact that all these phosphorus fertilizers that we use today are generated from mined phosphorus minerals, such as you see here in this picture. And so it's sort of a conundrum if you don't understand phosphorus fertilizers, because these forms of phosphorus that we're mining are relatively insoluble, yet the fertilizers that we're using for phosphorus are relatively soluble. So I'd like to make that connection between insoluble phosphorus and soluble phosphorus that you may buy at Home Depot or Lowe's or your local co-op. Before I make that connection, I'd like to just quickly show you this, that most of the world's phosphate reserves are found in Morocco. And then there's minor reserves, even though they may look large, but they're minor reserves in other countries across the globe. So I throw this question out to most of my students that are in production agriculture. Do any of you use rock phosphate as a phosphorus fertilizer source? And every single student says no, and they're correct. These phosphorus forms that we mine from, such as southeastern Idaho, are relatively insoluble. And why would you add those to a soil if they were insoluble and wouldn't release phosphorus to the environment to be used by plants? And so we manipulate those rock phosphates to form at least 4 phosphorus fertilizers that you may have heard of: triple superphosphate, monoammonium phosphate, diammonium phosphate, and ammonium polyphosphate. They contain different analyses based on how they were created. And so I asked the question to my students, and I'm going to ask that to you right now as well. So where do all the above phosphorus fertilizers originate? And I think we've already answered that question: from rock phosphate. And so this is what happens. And I'm going to give you some general information on how some of these phosphorus fertilizers are created. So for example, monoammonium phosphate contains ammonium and phosphate. It's solid. It looks like the picture in the bottom left-hand corner. And it's made by combining phosphoric acid with ammonia. The ammonia is coming from a process called the Haber-Bosch process, whereby we take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere under intense temperature and pressure in the presence of a catalyst and convert it to ammonia. Phosphoric acid actually comes from rock phosphate that we mine. And there's a simple equation here, a simple chemical equation that shows you the way by which phosphoric acid is created. We use rock phosphate in the presence of sulfuric acid, H2SO4, to create phosphoric acid. and calcium sulfate, or gypsum. Then we take that phosphoric acid and react it with ammonia from the Haber-Bosch process to make monoammonium phosphate. You can see the chemical formula for MAP in the top right-hand corner. It contains ammonium, but perhaps more importantly, it contains H2PO4. And so when you add this to a soil, these prills, or these fertilizer pellets, directly surrounding this pellet, as this pellet dissolves, can acidify the soil to about pH 5. And that has everything to do with the diagram that I showed you earlier, and where H2PO4 dominates. H2PO4 in this diagram is this sort of pinkish line, and it peaks out at about pH 5. And so when we use these types of fertilizers in soils, it can acidify locally around that prill or that fertilizer pellet to about pH 5. A second fertilizer that's used, actually, this fertilizer dominates phosphorus use in the world. This is diammonium phosphate, and it's made by combining phosphoric acid with ammonia. The chemical formula is ammonium and orthophosphate, but in this case, it's HPO4, not H2PO4. And so when we apply these prills or these fertilizer pellets to soils, that can result in an increase in pH around that prill to about pH 8.5 or 9. In the bottom right-hand corner, the HPO4 form is illustrated in yellow, and that peaks out around 8.5 or 9. The interesting thing about increasing pH is that actually can increase ammonia volatilization. And if you were using this fertilizer, you likely would not want to lose that ammonia or ammonium as ammonia gas. And so you need to be careful using this fertilizer, especially if you're using it with seeds. And a general recommendation is to limit the application of this fertilizer with a seed to about 10 to 20 pounds per acre to limit ammonia burn. Another form of phosphorus that we typically use is ammonium polyphosphate. It's a liquid. It's formed by essentially it's formed or created by reacting phosphoric acid with itself in the presence of ammonia. It's a liquid. It can be applied with seed with little risk due to volatilization. And that's because this form of fertilizer has a pH of about 6.8. That reduces the risk of volatilization losses. I think the other interesting thing about this fertilizer is that it can chelate metals. And so sometimes this can be combined with micronutrients to supply not only nitrogen and phosphorus, but for example, zinc. And it can be blended with other liquid nitrogen fertilizers, and it's often used as a starter fertilizer, or in some instances, such as here in eastern Colorado where I work, our producers use formulas like this for starter fertilizers across the eastern plains. So let me switch gears. So that's inorganic fertilizers, all of which come from rock phosphate. Some of you may be interested in using organic amendments, such as manures or compost or biosolids, etc. And there's some challenges with using those types of materials in terms of supplying nitrogen, or in terms of supplying phosphorus to plants. For one, there's no guaranteed analysis. And you can see some of the numbers that are shown down in the bottom right-hand corner in this table for various types of manures, the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, as well as potassium that's present. In inorganic fertilizers, as far as I know, every inorganic fertilizer in the market has a guaranteed analysis for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients. That's not the case with manures or other organic amendments. Also, there's non-uniform distribution of nutrients within these materials. So total nitrogen, for example, may not be the same as available nitrogen. That's typically the case, and you can see that in this table in the bottom right-hand corner again. Typically, when we apply these materials to soils, we typically apply based on the nitrogen needs of a crop. And more often than not, we over-apply phosphorus because it's needed in smaller quantities. So for example, swine waste, very top row in the table in the bottom right-hand corner, without bedding, contains about 6 pounds per ton of available nitrogen, and it contains quite a bit more phosphorus The plants require more nitrogen than phosphorus, so we typically overapply phosphorus to the system, which can end up being an issue in the long run. There's also compaction issues. It depends on what time of year you're applying manures. And of course, increasing regulations with manures all across the nation, if not globally. Some other points to consider in terms of phosphorus and manures or organic amendment application. Generally speaking, about 70% of the phosphorus that's present is available. That's inorganic. I mentioned point number 2. And then in terms of over applying phosphorus, when you apply based on nitrogen needs, there's a risk that needs to be considered in terms of phosphorus loss from soils and environmental impacts. So I think that leads me into the next section of this talk, and it deals with environmental risks of phosphorus. Some points to consider: that we as scientists know that about 90 to 95% of the phosphorus that's found in soils is bound to the soil in some form or another, either organic or inorganic. Knowing this, and knowing that most of the phosphorus is bound to soil, that if you can simply reduce off-site movement of soil particles into water bodies, you can greatly reduce environmental issues associated with phosphorus. And that's really important to know. So if you can reduce wind erosion or water erosion from sites, you reduce phosphorus risk to the environment. However, about 5 to 10% is still soluble in terms of phosphorus. And that fraction moves with water phases. And that makes that portion of phosphorus a real challenge to deal with. And I'll tell you why here in a few minutes. But the big question is, what's the big deal with off-site soil or phosphorus movement? And the big deal is waterway eutrophication, especially fresh waters. And if this was my backyard, I wouldn't be very happy. And this happens globally. And this is mainly due to phosphorus input into freshwater ecosystems. In fact, it happens all over the world. In the United States, this is a classic example. This is Lake Erie, part of the Great Lakes, just outside of Cleveland, Ohio. And this lake has some really interesting problems. So about 20 or 30 years ago, people realized that sediment transport into the lake was causing eutrophication. So sediment carrying phosphorus into the lake and releasing phosphorus to the lake was causing algal blooms, is what exactly you see here in the picture. The scenario has changed slightly. So we've done a great job in the United States of reducing sediment transport to this lake. We reduced algal blooms and eutrophication in the lake for about 20 years. And now we're starting to see algal blooms again, likely due to soluble phosphorus transport to the lake, which is something we need to deal with creatively. Here's a picture from New Zealand. This is Lake Ellesmere. It's a coastal lake. It's sort of a freshwater / brackish water lake that's affected greatly by phosphorus part of the year and greatly by nitrogen or nitrate nitrogen part of the year. And it's a real challenge because you're fighting two battles, but nonetheless, this lake does suffer from phosphorus issues. And the point I'm trying to make is that phosphorus is a global issue, not just local or regional or national in the US. And here's a picture or several pictures from freshwater systems in China. And certainly wouldn't let my children swim in this, but nonetheless, it's a problem that needs to be addressed. And so the environmental risks associated with offsite movement of phosphorus from any system into freshwater bodies is simply eutrophication. We mentioned this previously, that most often the limiting nutrient in freshwater systems is phosphorus, and that causes eutrophication in freshwater systems. In lakes, concentrations between about 0.1 to 0.2 parts per million or milligrams per liter of phosphorus generally accelerate eutrophication. It's not really very great. And in fact, if you were to look at soil solutions, the concentrations of orthophosphates in solution, or the soil solution, is about 10 times greater than those that accelerate eutrophication in lakes. So it really doesn't take much in terms of offsite movement of phosphorus in the liquid phase at great enough concentrations to affect phosphorus in water or freshwater systems. And in fact, there's a relatively straightforward correlation between lake phosphorus concentrations and chlorophyll concentrations. So I apologize I didn't put an R squared on this, but it's a relatively tight correlation. And in fact, I'm a soil scientist, and this is interesting, but when I look at soils, and many of you probably do the same thing if you're soil scientists or work with soils, and we try to make comparisons between plant available phosphorus in soils and runoff soluble phosphorus. In this case, this is Olsen extractable phosphorus on the x-axis and runoff soluble phosphorus on the y. And there's a correlation about close to 80% of the variability between Olsen P and runoff P can be explained by this equation. And so this tells you something, that you want to make sure that you keep your plant available phosphorus concentrations at a relatively low amount. You want to keep them in the ballpark that are necessary for plant growth, but you don't want to oversupply phosphorus to the system. And with that said, I want to tell you a story that's really interesting that deals with sediment and soluble phosphorus issues here in the United States. And this is a story that I actually worked on several years ago in Idaho, in south central Idaho. So Idaho, if you're not familiar with where Idaho is located, it's in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And in south central Idaho, there's an irrigated watershed called the Upper Rock Creek Watershed. It's over 200,000 acres. It's split roughly 60-40%. 60% of this irrigation system is furrow irrigated and 40% is sprinkler irrigated. When it was put in the early 1900s, it was 100% furrow irrigated. And so some of the issues with furrow irrigation deal directly with sediment transport and particle detachment from systems. And so I'm going to show you three pictures here. The picture on the left-hand side is a furrow that's used for irrigation purposes. And obviously sediment has been detached from soils and is moving in that water column down these furrows. Those furrows at the end of fields are connected to either laterals or pulleys or another means by which the water is conveyed off-site. That's the center picture. And that water actually ends up eventually back into a fresh water body. The top right-hand corner picture is the Snake River that runs through south central Idaho. And I was fortunate enough to work with some wonderful scientists at the USDA Agricultural Research Service Center in Kimberly, Idaho. The work that was done in the early 1970s at this research location showed that 450 kilograms per hectare of soil was lost simply due to furrow irrigation. It's a huge amount. And due to a number of factors, in the mid-2000s, we were able to reduce that to about 10 kilograms per hectare. A very substantial decrease in sediment loss from these systems. And they were due mainly in part to best management practices that were used in these systems. And so what were those best management practices? Well, the early 1900s through about 1980, this system used furrow irrigation, and slowly through programs such as the EQIP program, producers have been slowly switching over to sprinkler irrigation, which greatly reduces runoff and erosional losses. Producers have used materials such as polyacrylamide. This material is placed in irrigation water. The material forms sort of a web, if you will, with soil particles and holds them in place. So the picture on the left-hand side is without, and the picture on the right-hand side is with polyacrylamide. Other practices that have been used are filter strips. So strips are areas that are dedicated to reduce the water velocity and settle sediment out of solution. These are typically placed at the end of furrows. And I would say that probably one of the greatest best management practices in systems such as this are the use of sedimentation ponds that are placed in strategic locations to reduce water velocity and settle particles out of solution. So I want to share with you a brief story here about these sedimentation ponds. The sedimentation ponds that are used in these systems are typically in series. There are two ponds placed in series. The first pond is a cleaning pond, and the second pond is a clarifying pond. The first pond in the series is used to settle particles or soil out of solution. And that's what you see in this top graph. Pond 1, water coming in, out. Pond 2, water coming in and out at various time intervals across a growing season, and the sediment concentrations in that water column. And you can see that the sediment concentrations decreased greatly from pond 1 in to pond 1 out. And that tells you that the sediment is settling out. Pond 2 is more of a clarifying cell, doesn't really remove that much sediment. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And so the story here is, if you know something about sediment and sediment transport and how sediment acts and interacts in water columns, you can set up a system whereby you remove sediment from a water column that would return to a freshwater system and greatly reduce the amount of phosphorus that would affect that freshwater system. This is a relatively easy fix. All you need is a little bit of land base to do this. So here's the challenge in these systems. The bottom graph shows you pond 1 in, out, and pond 2 in and out, and the dissolved phosphorus phase. And you can see that these ponds do relatively nothing in terms of removing dissolved phosphorus. So we can do a great job of removing 90 to maybe 95% of the phosphorus that's in a water column simply by removing sediment. But the other 5 to 10% that's in the solution phase is a real challenge. And before I go any further, I would like to give credit to Dr. April Latham from the USDA Agricultural Research Service for collecting this data a number of years ago. And so here's the issue. We need to deal with soluble phosphorus. And you can see on this bottom graph that the total maximum daily load is typically exceeded with dissolved phosphorus. So how do we fix this? And I can fill you in on how we can fix this creatively. I'm not going to include this in this talk, but we can do it via chemical injections. And if you would like to know more, feel free to contact me. And again, my contact information will be at the end of this slide presentation. And so the soluble phosphorus is the real challenge. And to get a better grasp on soluble phosphorus in these water systems, I was lucky enough to be asked by Dr. Nathan Nelson at Kansas State University, who was finishing up a postdoc in Kimberly, Idaho at the time I started, to look at soluble phosphorus retention in these irrigation laterals. And so what Nathan did was set up a series of these events where he injected orthophosphate into an irrigation lateral that you see here in this picture, and he measured phosphorus concentration downstream from this injection point. And he did it in 3 irrigation laterals across this irrigated watershed. And this is